In early America, liberty didn't belong to everyone. In the South, it belonged to the few. They built mansions along the river, wide estates, imported wealth, power that stretched as far as the eye could see. But just beyond those estates, something else was growing: anger, resentment, and a very different idea of liberty. Here, liberty didn't mean equality. It meant independence for those who had power. In 1676, that anger exploded. Armed men marched on their own capital and burned it to the ground. Why would English settlers destroy their own colony? And what does that tell us about liberty in early America? Because from the very beginning, Americans did not agree on what liberty meant. And when those visions collided, it didn't end in debate. To understand what happened, we have to go back to a very different vision of freedom, a vision built on land, hierarchy, and power. Not all settlers came to America seeking religious purity or communal order. Some came to recreate something else entirely. They were known as Cavaliers, royalists, aristocrats, men who believed society should be led by those born to rule. When they arrived in Virginia, they didn't build tight communities, they built estates. Land meant power, and power meant independence from interference. To them, liberty was not about equality. It was about being left alone to rule your domain. The greater your land, the greater your freedom, and the fewer people who could tell you what to do. This was a different kind of liberty than the Puritans. Not moral discipline, but personal authority. The Puritans believed liberty required order. The Cavaliers believed liberty required status. Freedom was something you possessed, not something everyone shared. And maintaining that freedom required control. Over land, over labor, over society itself. But this system had a problem. It created two very different worlds inside the same colony. Along the rivers lived the elite, wealthy, protected, politically powerful. But further inland, life looked very different. Small farmers, isolated families, constant danger. They faced threats the elites rarely saw: conflict, uncertainty, and survival without protection. The frontier settlers were not asking for luxury, they were asking for protection. The system didn't just fail them, it abandoned them. Raids and violence were part of daily life, and help from the colonial government rarely came. The men who governed Virginia lived far away from these dangers, and their priorities looked very different. Governor Sir William Berkeley had ruled for decades, and he governed for stability, not expansion. He feared that pushing further into the frontier would provoke more conflict, so he chose restraint. To the elite, this was responsible leadership. To the settlers, it felt like abandonment. The farther you lived from power, the less protection you received, and the more your idea of liberty began to change. For the elite, liberty meant being left alone to rule. For the frontier, liberty meant survival. And survival without protection does not feel like freedom. It feels like neglect. Resentment began to spread, quiet at first, then louder. This wasn't just a conflict in Virginia, it was an early warning of a question America would never fully escape. Into that tension stepped a young man with ambition and a willingness to act where others would not. His name was Nathaniel Bacon, and he would become the voice of that anger. Nathaniel Bacon saw what the frontier settlers saw: danger without protection, authority without accountability. But he also saw something else, an opportunity. He promised action, immediate, forceful, unapologetic. To the settlers, he looked like leadership. To the elite, he looked like rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon demanded the right to organize a militia, to take the fight to the frontier. Governor Sir William Berkeley refused. He saw something dangerous in Bacon's rise, because once people take power into their own hands, it rarely stops where it begins. But Nathaniel Bacon didn't wait. He acted anyway. What began as frontier defense quickly became something more: a challenge to authority itself. The line between protecting liberty and seizing power began to blur. In 1676, the conflict reached its breaking point. Bacon's forces marched on Jamestown, and when they took the city, they made a decision that would echo through history. This was not a revolution for independence. It was a rebellion born from competing visions of liberty. The elite saw liberty as order and control. The frontier saw liberty as protection and action. And when those visions collided, there were no institutions strong enough to contain it. A truth had surfaced. Liberty without balance leads to instability. Too much control breeds resentment. Too little control breeds chaos. And somewhere between those extremes, a new idea would eventually emerge. Can a society hold together when its people define liberty in completely different ways? Or does that tension inevitably lead to conflict? Eventually, though, the tension broke, not in debate, but in fire. A rebellion, led not by kings, but by men who believed liberty had been denied to them. And what happened next would expose a truth the South could no longer ignore. For the fight for liberty never ends. It only changes hands.